Everyone thinks Germany had the perfect war machine, but it was designed to crash. In the winter of 1941, somewhere outside Moscow, a German soldier tried to light a cigarette. His fingers were too numb to hold the match. The flame flickered once in the wind and died. Around him, trucks that had crossed half of Europe sat frozen in place, their engines solid blocks of ice. The uniforms issued for a quick autumn victory were no match for a Russian winter that had no intention of cooperating. He had been told the war would be over by Christmas. It was not. That dying matchstick, small, fragile, extinguished by forces it did not understand, is where the story of Germany's fatal World War II strategy truly begins. Because from the very first day, the war Germany planned was not the war it would actually fight. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he did not just inherit a wounded nation, he inherited humiliation. The memory of defeat in 1918, the economic collapse of the Weimar years, the national resentment baked into the Treaty of Versailles. These were not background conditions, they were fuel. But what Hitler offered was not simply recovery, it was destiny. Germany, he argued, did not just need jobs or stability. It needed expansion. It needed living space. It needed to undo history itself. And here is where the first fatal fracture appears. Ideology began to replace reality. In strategic terms, wars are fought with logistics, industry, manpower, geography. But the Nazi worldview reduced all of that to something much simpler: belief. The belief that racial superiority would compensate for material weakness. The belief that willpower could bend economics. The belief that enemies were weak, decadent, and destined to collapse. It is a dangerous thing when a nation starts mistaking conviction for capability. In the beginning, it seemed to work. In 1939, Poland fell in weeks. In 1940, France, the great continental power that had bled Germany dry a generation earlier, collapsed in just 6. German armored columns sliced through the Ardennes forest, a route the Allies considered impassable. The speed was breathtaking. Radio-coordinated tanks, dive bombers screaming out of the sky, infantry moving with mechanical precision. The world called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Blitzkrieg was less a master plan and more a necessity. Germany did not possess the industrial depth for a long war against multiple global powers. It did not have the oil reserves of the United States. It did not have the manpower reserves of the Soviet Union. It did not have the global empire of Britain. So it needed speed. Blitzkrieg was a gamble. Win fast, win decisively, and force political collapse before economic reality could catch up. And for a moment, the gamble paid off. But speed has a hidden weakness. The faster you move, the longer your supply lines stretch. The deeper you push, the more you depend on fuel. Spare parts, food, and winter clothing arriving exactly when needed. Lightning is powerful, but it cannot sustain itself. By 1941, Hitler turned east. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was not just another campaign. It was ideological war made physical. Hitler believed the Soviet state was rotten, propped up by what he considered inferior people and incompetent leadership. He believed it would collapse like France. Many German generals were skeptical. The distances alone were staggering. Moscow was not Paris. The Russian winter was not a Western European autumn. But under the Führer Principle, the idea that ultimate authority rested in one-man descent had limits. In Nazi Germany, strategic debate did not end with consensus. It ended with Hitler. And this was the second fatal flaw. Modern warfare requires flexibility. It demands adaptation when intelligence changes, when terrain surprises you, when the enemy does something unexpected. But Hitler increasingly micromanaged decisions from afar, refusing retreats, splitting offensives, redirecting armored divisions based on instinct rather than logistics. In 1941, German forces advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Millions of prisoners were taken. And yet, the Soviet Union did not collapse, because the enemy gets a vote. Factories were dismantled and moved east of the Ural Mountains. Entire industrial complexes were rebuilt beyond the reach of German bombers. Soviet manpower reserves, vast and brutalized, kept filling the front lines. Harsh winter conditions slowed German equipment that had never been designed for such cold. By December, German troops could see the outskirts of Moscow. They would never take it. And while Germany bled in the snow, something else was happening across the Atlantic. The United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. American industry, already formidable, shifted into wartime production at a scale the world had never seen. Shipyards launched vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the tens of thousands. Tanks were produced not in hundreds, but in torrents. This is where industrial reality shattered industrial fantasy. Germany's war machine looked unstoppable on the battlefield, but behind it was an economy strained to its limits. Oil shortages plagued operations. Synthetic fuel programs could not meet demand. Allied bombing campaigns targeted railways, refineries, factories, slowly squeezing the arteries that fed the front. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union outproduced Germany in tanks and artillery. The United States outproduced everyone in almost everything. War, at its core, is mathematics. And the numbers were turning. Still, Hitler doubled down. In 1942, instead of consolidating gains in the Soviet Union, he split his forces again, driving toward the Caucasus oil fields while simultaneously committing to the battle for Stalingrad. It was a city that carried symbolic weight because it bore Stalin's name. Symbolism began to outweigh strategy. The result was catastrophic. At Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army became trapped. Soviet forces encircled them in a maneuver as bold as anything Germany had executed earlier in the war. Supplies could not reach them in sufficient quantities. Winter returned. Hunger and frostbite did their quiet work. Hitler refused withdrawal. In February 1943, what remained of the Sixth Army surrendered. It was the first time an entire German field army had been destroyed. From that moment, the momentum shifted irreversibly. But even then, Germany did not adjust its core assumptions. Ideology continued to distort strategic clarity. Occupied territories were brutalized rather than integrated. Potential allies were alienated through racial policy. Resources were diverted into wonder weapons, rockets, jet aircraft, technologies ahead of their time but too few, too late to alter the broader equation. The war Germany had imagined, short, decisive, driven by superior will, had become a grinding global conflict against three industrial superpowers: the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire. And here lies the final truth. Germany could win battles. It could execute brilliant operational maneuvers. Its officer corps produced tactically innovative commanders. Its early campaigns reshaped military doctrine worldwide, but it could not win the war it had chosen to start. Because from the beginning, the strategy was built on illusions that enemies would collapse quickly, that ideology could substitute for economics, that centralized authority would outperform collective planning, that brutality would create stability. Reality, patient and indifferent, eroded those illusions one winter at a time. By 1945, Berlin was encircled. The Red Army advanced street by street. Allied bombers had reduced cities to rubble. Fuel was scarce. Trains barely ran. Teenagers and old men were handed rifles. In a bunker beneath the ruins of his capital, Adolf Hitler still issued orders to divisions that no longer existed. The matchstick had finally burned out. When we look back at World War II, it is tempting to see inevitability to believe Germany was always destined to lose. But that misses the deeper lesson. Nations do not fall because they lack power alone. They fall when power is misaligned with reality. Germany's fatal strategy was not simply military overreach. It was the decision to build war on belief instead of capacity, to assume speed would replace sustainability, to silence dissent when adaptation was required, to underestimate opponents who refused to behave according to script. And in the end, the world it tried to conquer proved far larger, more resilient and more industrial than its ideology allowed it to imagine. That soldier outside Moscow, struggling to light a cigarette in the snow, did not know any of this. He only knew the cold, the hunger, the silence after artillery fire fades. History, though, sees the pattern. The war Germany could win existed only in theory. The war it fought against geography, economics, and time itself was unwinnable from the start. But while the German army was being crushed by the weight of the Russian winter, the Soviets were busy using that same ice to perform a logistical miracle, to see how a frozen lake became the only thing standing between a starving city and total annihilation. Click here to watch the story of the road that saved Leningrad.